Well, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. Jennifer, thanks for the invite to kind of talk to you about the ways we're approaching sort of these resiliency questions in the Tampa Bay region, particularly focusing on natural capital investments. You heard a lot about sort of resiliency initiatives focused around infrastructure and, improving flooding conditions in your region, but we're really focused on improving the natural capital that offers all those flood mitigating benefits that hard infrastructure does, as well as other ecosystem services that are important. One of the big things that Jennifer asked me to speak about was a blue carbon study that we did back in about 2015, 2016 time period. And just to gauge sort of the audience, how many of you all heard of blue carbon or know what blue carbon is? So about half that, sorry. Excellent. So the NEPs are great at raising awareness around these scientific topics, but for those other half of the room, it looked like that don't know what blue carbon means, it's basically referring to the habitats like mangroves, seagrasses, marsh, salt-bearing habitats that are really effective at capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in their biomass and soils. So they're actually really good at doing that, and that offers a climate mitigating sort of a benefit to us locally as well as globally for these habitats spread throughout the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've developed different coastal habitat restoration targets, and then get into how we could use blue carbon habitats to further incentivize and drive restoration in our region and throughout the state of Florida. So with that, I'll kind of give you a little bit of overview of our watershed and the area I work just north of here. So, Tampa Bay Watershed spans about 6 counties. 3 primarily sit on the Bay's coast: Hillsborough, Pinellas, and Manatee counties. Our open water area is about 400 square miles. The land surface that drains the estuary is about 5 times as large. So those green areas represented by the county boundaries represent about 2,200 square miles. Shallow estuary, similar to what you have down here in Charlotte Harbor. Some of the major tributaries that drain are along the eastern periphery of our bay, and that's where we have a lot of our low salinity marsh habitats that still remain in our region, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But one of the big key things I just want to point out, we're an urban estuary. We have now greater than 3.1 million people living within our watershed. That's projected to increase, and this slide is kind of relaying that fact. So by mid-century, we're looking at almost doubling our population in this area. All those red areas on the map on the right are basically suburban and urban development. The yellow areas are remnant agriculture. Purple is mining areas within our watershed. And the green, interspersed in the upper parts of the watershed as well as along the coast, are the remaining native habitats. So really, we only have about 1/3 of our lands that are left undeveloped in the Tampa Bay region. And that really has created the sense of urgency to continue to protect key habitats that are important to the estuarine function of our Tampa Bay. So with that in mind, we actually embarked on an approach to establish some fairly aggressive goals to ensure that those habitats persist in the future. We followed a similar process to what has been conducted down here in Charlotte Harbor, basically using a GIS exercise to identify the remaining opportunities where we could continue to protect, preserve, and also restore habitats in the Tampa Bay region. And the flowchart basically is a convoluted GIS exercise to really partition down where specific habitats might be able to persist into the future. And when you do that, we've created these maps on the right that basically highlight where the existing native habitats are within our watershed. The darker areas are what we call opportunities, or areas that we can restore to native habitats that are important to the estuarine function. And based on these maps, we came up with certain goals for 2030, about 7 years from now, as well as by mid-century in 2050. So those targets are highlighted in blue on the left for 2030 and in red in 2050. So in total, we're trying to get back about 3,000 acres of these combined habitats within the watershed by 2030, and a little over 10,000 by mid-century. And when we do this exercise, the other thing that pops out is that, we, with the land use condition, we can identify the restorable opportunities, and there isn't a dearth of those opportunities in our watershed. Even though, we're rapidly urbanizing, we still have over 450,000 acres of available lands where we could do this work. We could restore those 3,000 acres of different habitats by 2030 and up to the 10,000 by 2050. So we're not going to be competing with existing development. There are plenty of opportunities out there. We just need to capitalize on them now before they actually do become homes in the future. So that's sort of the big take home of doing this GIS exercise. And within that broader space of 450,000 acres, looking at different soil and flooding conditions, there's probably about 209,000 acres that are really prime for restoration of the suite of different habitats that make our estuary function. Those are the seagrasses, the mangroves, marshes, as well as the freshwater wetlands, coastal uplands, and other important habitats that occur up in the headwater areas. So how are we doing? We use these report card tools to kind of relay to the community in a red, yellow, green sort of stoplight function, how well we're doing in terms of meeting those goals in 2030. So the colors relate to whether or not the target is being met, and whether, when we compare different land use years, if we're on the right trajectory, basically looking at if we're doing enough restoration activity to see increases in those different habitats through time in the land use land cover information. And what this tells us, we need to do a lot more work on restoring seagrass habitats, especially lately. We've seen a significant decline in our estuary as well as other estuaries in Southwest Florida. And we still have a lot more work to do in terms of restoring oyster, salt marsh, and freshwater wetland and upland habitats. So there's a lot of room for growth. In some cases, we are on track, or we're already meeting the targets, particularly for mangroves and salt barren habitats. And we're on a good trajectory. We still have a lot of active restoration projects, particularly with salt barrens we're going to gain a lot more of those habitats in the future. But there's still a lot of work to do for those habitats that I'm highlighting on the left there. And this graphic also kind of brings the message home of the sense of urgency. The graphic on the right basically shows where the flow of land uses have gone from the 1990s to 2020, basically looking at a 30-year span of land use land cover information. And that brown basically bar in the middle of the graphic relates to the restorable habitats in the watershed. So over that 30-year span, we lost, or you see the flow of that brown bar going to the blue bar, we lost about 120,000 acres of potentially restorable habitat to develop lands over that 30-year time span. At the same time, we've gained about 180,000 acres. So if we continue at this pace, we are going to lose those restoration opportunities in the future. So again, this is just highlighting that the urgency to capitalize on restoration opportunities for these habitats across the spectrum needs to happen now, or else we lose those opportunities and potentially lose those opportunities in the future. And one of the ways that we're trying to drive sort of restoration and create additional incentives for restoration of key habitats is looking at the value of blue carbon. Globally, there was a recent study. It's highlighted on the right there on Beltran 2021 graphic. The U.S. is second in the world in terms of the potential carbon sequestration potential habitats that we have along our coast. We're second only to Australia. So we have a huge potential to capitalize on carbon markets if we can continue to allow these habitats to persist into the future. And Florida is unique. We have the full suite of different blue carbon habitats that actually disproportionately store more carbon than some of even the more traditional, tropical forest ecosystems that are also in peril globally. So if we could continue to protect and preserve these habitats, they can do a great job of sequestering carbon for us in the future. Restorative Estuaries put out an estimate in 2021 that valued our blue carbon ecosystems, those habitats in the Tampa Bay area, around about 7 to 44 million. And that's all dependent on the price of carbon in the voluntary carbon markets, which is now fluctuating, I think, between $40 to $80 per metric ton of carbon stock. So getting to the work that we did in the Tampa Bay region, worked with some environmental science associates contractors, as well as the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission scientists to understand the stock of blue carbon habitats that we have in the Tampa Bay region. And really, that was basically catalyzing both our estimating the above ground, below ground, and soil biomass of stored carbon in these different habitats, and then try to understand what the future trajectory of those habitats might be based on different sea level rise, habitat response scenarios, as well as policy choices that we might make in the future to either allow those habitats to migrate upslope, or if we continue to develop along those coast, along the coast, create barriers for those habitats to migrate as sea level rise continues. So through that lens, we were able to come up with different estimates of what those projections might be. And this is sort of a busy table, but the take home is, if you look at the gray bar, that's basically what we estimated based on 2007 conditions. We had about 71 million metric tons of carbon sequestered in coastal habitats, and these are inclusive of all land uses along the coast. And when you take a look at sort of different climate risk scenarios in terms of low or high sea level rise, whether or not the habitats will be able to keep pace with sea level rise through creating sediments slowly or more quickly, and then also looking at sort of those policy choices of allowing the habitats to migrate versus creating additional barriers in the future for them to persist along the coast. We come up with these different estimates that range in number, but the two that I'm highlighting are basically contrasting the low and high estimates. And it's basically run 3 and run 6 look at a high sea level rise scenario and conditions where the habitats aren't able to keep pace with sea level rise and are basically prevented from migrating upslope, versus they are able to keep pace and they're allowed to also migrate as sea level rise occurs in the future. So they ranged from sort of a net benefit of sequestering about 1.4 million metric tons of carbon in those combined habitats moving forward to about 2.7. But on average, if we look across all these scenarios, we could still expect these Tampa Bay habitats to sequester about 2.1 million metric tons of carbon in natural lands moving forward. And that equates to roughly, I'm forgetting the number now, but I think it equates to about 2.5 million gallons of gasoline emissions per year, every year going out to 2100. So that's a significant ecosystem service if we allow these habitats to perform that function for us into the future. And I'm going to kind of talk through this graphic a little bit. So that baseline year is 2007. That's sort of highlighted in red. And this is kind of giving you an idea of how we've done in terms of maintaining those habitats in the Tampa Bay region since we did this study. So we're doing pretty good up until about 2016. We had some huge increases in seagrasses, and that was driving the total combined acreage of seagrass, mangrove, salt marsh, and salt barren habitats. But the bottoms kind of fell out. We're starting to lose our carbon stock in the Tampa Bay region, and we're actually seeing decreases in seagrass acreage both in 2020 and most recently in 2022 estimates. So if you look at that 2022 bar and compare it to 2025, 2050, 2075, 2100, those are basically what we projected using that model to in terms of the total estimated stock of those different habitats moving forward using that modeling approach. We're trending in the wrong direction is basically what I'm saying. And in 2020, we are below what we were expecting to be in 2025. So we need to do better. We need to do better to protect these habitats. We need to do better in terms of allowing these habitats to do the important ecosystem services that they can do for us to mitigate climate change moving forward. I'm not sure if this is going to work. We'll see. It's kind of an animation, but this is basically showing you the model outputs. The darker green areas are seagrasses. The lighter green areas are mangrove habitats. And the graphic on the left is basically the base condition, the condition of those habitats in 2007. The lighter pink areas are basically areas where these habitats could potentially migrate into. The red areas are more developed and would be prevented to migrate in the future. And if you look on the graphic on the right is basically a projection of where those habitats might migrate to in the future. Those darker green areas on the right are basically seagrasses invading newly inundated areas and basically capitalizing in areas that are rural mangroves and now submerged and potentially lost. So there'll be a huge potential modeled shift in terms of the suite of habitats that we might have in the Tampa Bay region. And it's all kind of dependent on the choices we make to protect these coastal areas and potentially allow or prevent those habitats from migrating upslope. So I think if I go forward, you can see sort of the difference in model projections and the toggle back and forth. Basically, what our model is telling us is that there's sort of this uncertainty period between 2050 and 2075 where if seagrasses are able to capitalize on those newly inundated areas, they'll compensate for large losses in mangroves that we're expecting because the mangroves have nowhere to go and they're potentially going to be inundated and lost. So that really plays into how we could estimate sort of the carbon potential and sequestration potential for those habitats moving forward. What sort of the end result of that modeling work suggests is that there's particular certainly that we're going to lose a lot of salt marsh habitats to the point where those salt marsh habitats might be carbon sources in the future. Those lost habitats will actually be emitting the carbon that they stored if we don't protect them. And then that large uncertainty in terms of seagrasses and mangroves I show there is really assuming that both of those habitats would be able to keep pace or compensate for one another. If that isn't the case, then those will also be potential source of carbon that is emitted into the environment. So a lot of the uncertainty in terms of the rate of sea level rise, how those habitats are going to be able to respond, either being able to accrete sediments to keep pace with future sea level rise conditions, and what are our policies going to be moving forward in terms of preventing those habitats to migrate and go into newly inundated areas versus preventing them from doing so. So with all that being said, the time to act is now, and really what I hope I've highlighted is that the opportunities to do this work are going to be limited both now and into the future. And in particular with these blue carbon habitats, even with the goals that we've already established, like I said, we came up with goals for 2050 for those mangrove intertidal wetland habitats of about 3,500 more acres by 2050. If we look at the opportunity maps, we don't have that space now for those particular habitats. So we're going to have to create space or other incentives to allow those habitats to persist, especially salt marsh habitats. And right now, with the large losses in seagrasses, we're already squandering some of the past investments we made to restore some of those key habitats. Over the history of our program and working with the Nitrogen Management Consortium, we've estimated about $2.5 billion of investments to try to get seagrasses and water quality back to conditions conducive to support seagrasses. We're now going in the wrong direction. We're losing that carbon to the environment. That's contributing to probably additional climate change impacts. We need to reverse the course, and a lot of that is looking at ways where we could capitalize on both these goals for the suite of habitats I mentioned, but also look at ways that we could improve water quality for the benefit of seagrasses. We know that we're not going to plan our way back. I'm stealing a term from Dr. Dwayne Freeze on the Indian River Lagoon, who's been struggling with regaining seagrasses. We're not going to plan our way back in terms of seagrasses, of restoring those key habitats, we have to improve water quality. And some of that is going to be work that we need to do within the watershed. An example of that is shown here on the right. I mentioned, we are a fairly urban watershed, so there's limited opportunity to do really big projects now. The graphic on the right is basically highlighting a golf course that sits on Old Tampa Bay, one of our priority water bodies where we've seen the most seagrass losses, and we've seen water quality issues that were contributing to those seagrass losses. The graphic on the right is basically a golf course, and the pink areas is what is projected that golf course to be inundated in the future with different sea level rise scenarios. So working at this golf course, we're trying to come to some understanding of potential habitat incentives that could occur if they allowed sort of that tidal incursion to happen, and salt marshes, mangroves are allowed to come into that golf course. There's some incentive, both in terms of reestablishing some of those key habitats, but also sort of nutrient attenuation as well as carbon sequestration benefits that would be allowed to occur if those habitats were allowed to basically grow within that golf course space. It also would create some additional resiliency for the surrounding neighborhoods that are currently flooding now. They're fairly low-lying areas, and this golf course areas could be used to further attenuate some of those flooding conditions in the surrounding communities. Other sort of work we're trying to do is, using our grant programs to drive investments towards these key habitats. We have a Tampa Bay Mini Grant program that's funded through the sales of our license plate that has been used to, support rain gardens and more of our urban areas, as well as to encourage homeowners that live on the water to create vertical oyster gardens or bogs to reestablish oysters. And then we also have a larger grant fund called the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund, where we're actually supporting some larger scale living shoreline projects. The project on the right is in Safety Harbor, basically reestablishing marshes in areas and creating amenities, quite frankly, for some of the communities. There's now a boardwalk that goes through there, as well as a lawn space that's adjacent to this restoration where they have large festivals. So basically trying to create these different incentives to get these habitats back through these grant funding, but also hopefully to drive it using carbon offsets. So all the things I talked about in terms of the importance of blue carbons, it's not sort of theory. There are actually projects being put in place in practice. Hillsborough County is actually one of the first governments in our area to actually invest in a carbon offset program. This is actually a forest preserve project. So they're actually getting carbon offset credits for preserving some of their upland forest. They're making basically a 40-year commitment, and they've gone through a third-party verification process to generate about 162,000 of emission reduction ton credits. That to them equates to about $1.5 million. So that's revenue that they're bringing in just for preserving some of those natural habitats. And what initiated this was a private party buyer, talking with the county and seeing if they had any credits available specifically for carbon credits. So there is a voluntary market for this work. There are companies now investing in this. There's actually companies investing overseas that are American-based companies that we could be driving those investments towards protection of our habitats here within the state and the broader nation, if we allow that to happen. And one of the biggest things that is sort of a barrier right now for particularly coastal habitats is the cost of verifying, monitoring, and certifying carbon credits is fairly high, particularly for coastal areas. So that is a huge barrier to initiate these projects. One of the bigger barriers for us as an urban estuary is that we have a very limited amount of space to find these projects. So it only makes sense based on the price of carbon to do really, really big projects at this point. And we don't have 100,000 acres of salt marsh or mangrove areas that these interested entities might be able to invest in terms of purchasing carbon credits. So one of the things that is referred to in the paper that we worked on for this blue carbon project is one of the ways we're trying to get around that is potentially creating collaborative or grouping projects together so that we can increase the amount of acreage where these investments could be made. But again, one of the big barriers is sort of those verification, monitoring, and certification costs that come with going through this carbon offset program. So I think I talk really fast, but I still got a couple of minutes. But hopefully, if you take anything away from this talk, is that protect what we have. It only makes sense in terms of the ecosystem services that they provide in terms of the natural aesthetic, the beauty and joy of living in Florida and in our communities. It's the reason why probably 1,000 people per day moved to the state of Florida last year, 1,000 people plus per day moved to the state of Florida each year. If we lose those habitats, we're squandering a lot of the investments we've already made to protect them and ensure they persist. And I think there's ways that we can overcome these barriers in terms of driving additional investment towards Florida-based habitats such as seagrasses, mangroves, marsh habitats. There's always examples of policy in the nation. Virginia passed a seagrass blue carbon market legislation a couple of years ago. They have some of the similar concerns in terms of trying to regain seagrasses in Chesapeake Bay. So this is, again, an additional driver that we as the state of Florida should be advocating for, because we have the full suite of blue carbon habitats that are important to sequester carbon and mitigate the impacts of climate change in the future. The choice is whether or not we want to act now. So I'll stop there.
Well, we have some questions I know that are going to already be coming in for you, so we'll get right to those. So is Tampa Bay shifting restoration efforts more towards mangroves rather than seagrass? Research suggests seagrass could be carbon sources rather than sinks and have low survival rates in restoration.
So mangroves are actually doing pretty well. And as I mentioned during the talk, I think the uncertainty is whether or not mangroves will do well towards the tail end of the century. So some of the research that has been conducted in Tampa Bay suggests that the mangroves are keeping pace with the existing sea level rise. There are some areas where they're called mangrove heart attack areas where we've seen some losses of mangrove. But overall, on a coverage basis, we're doing pretty well. We actually have as much mangroves in Tampa Bay right now, if not more than what was present in 1950s. And part of that is due to climate change. We are probably going to become more of a mangrove dominated system in the future. To a point, like I mentioned, there's huge uncertainty from 2050 to 2075 of whether or not we'll still have areas along the coast to allow these mangroves to persist. Seagrasses are key estuarine habitat for us. Our focus in terms of trying to restore seagrasses are really directed towards improving water quality conditions, allowing enough light to penetrate to allow these seagrasses to persist. And as I mentioned, we're currently going in the wrong direction. We've lost from 2016 to 2022 a little over 11,500 acres of seagrasses. That's a significant amount of a coastal habitat loss, almost to the point of what's being seen on the East Coast. So a lot of our effort is still directed towards allowing those seagrasses to persist. And frankly, both those habitats I think are going to be important in the future, particularly for carbon sequestration benefits, but also for all the other services, fish and wildlife benefits that they elicit to our estuary. So it's not a choice of one over the other. We need them all.
And how are carbon offsites quantified through the study you shared? Could that science apply to Charlotte Harbor?
Yeah, it's basically real rough estimates. If you actually go through with an actual verified project, there's some rigorous testing that's required. There's actually what's called a verified carbon standard that you have to follow for these different type of restoration projects. We basically just did a screening level based on just the coverage of those different habitats, some assumptions about how they might accrete sediments in the future, and then came up with rough estimates of what their sequestration potential could be in the future. The next step is actually identifying projects, partners that want to invest in that carbon offset project and actually go through the verification process. Kind of similar to what Hillsborough County did for that forested preserve project for blue carbon, but for blue carbon habitats.
Who did Hillsborough County sell the carbon credits to?
I don't know.
Okay.
They did not want to be disclosed, but they were approached by a party that was interested in purchasing carbon offset credits, and the county went through this process to go through the verification. And for them, it's like I said, it's generating for them about $1.5 million of revenue.
Is thin layer sediment placement being considered to enhance maintenance of existing mangrove habitat?
Yep, that's been discussed, and particularly if we also conduct what we call a critical coastal habitat assessment. We have about 9 different transects spread out through Tampa Bay, looking at both more pristine site versus restored areas, and looking at the trajectory of accretion of those different habitats that occur along the coast. And if that monitoring reveals that those habitats aren't keeping pace in terms of building up their sediments in response to sea level rise, that could be a potential option moving forward.
Is there a carbon offset market further south where there is more opportunity for restoration? So any thoughts on how that would apply to this region?
Yeah, right now, I think the only mechanism is through the voluntary carbon markets. There are some regulated markets out in California and I think in Canada that there's some participation in. But right now, anyone can invest in a carbon offset project. They just need to go through the verified carbon standard process to estimate what those reductions are going to be. It has to be basically an avoidance impact. It can't be something related to mitigation. And it's all subject to, as I mentioned, the current price of carbon. So that's really driving how large a project might be to offset those monitoring and verification costs in the future, and have a willing land partner to actually, invest in and make the commitment to, manage the lands a certain way to maintain those habitats.
All right, let's try to go through a couple more very quickly. Please compare carbon market value of preservation versus restoration of wetlands.
Let's compare, please.
The carbon offset, sorry, where was it? Carbon market value of preservation versus restoration of wetlands. Is there a difference?
It's all going to be tied to what the expected habitat coverage would be for those habitats. So if you're preserving habitats, it will be sort of the inherent sequestration from the existing above ground, below ground biomass and any sediment accumulation that might occur in those habitats versus what might be exported or emitted through different natural processes like methane emission. That's something you have to monitor for. In a restored habitat, you're basically starting from scratch, and you have to, verify through time that the estimates for that restored acreage that you're trying to restore back to is actually being realized. So that's sort of the differences and how you might approach a project. And it's all tied to what's the current state and what is the projected state, and whether or not your monitoring shows you're on that path. And that basically verifies the credit you might garner from that project.
And then there were some questions about, can you ally with an urban forest to enter the program? It was talking about the Growing Climate Solutions Act as part of the omnibus bill that the USDA is supposed to help with third-party verification. There was another one above about agriculture. Is there opportunities to partner with agriculture, urban forests, other types of sectors? Yeah,
and that's one of the big opportunities for us in the Tampa Bay region that land use cover map I showed that showed both the reds and yellows. Those yellow areas are current agricultural lands. There are certain agricultural lands along our coast that we know are going to be vulnerable in the future. They could be utilized for carbon markets if, those lands become inundated and are unusable for agriculture productions. They might actually be able to raise salt marsh or mangrove habitats and earn a credit and on a carbon offset for doing that production rather than agricultural production. So yeah, those are opportunity areas. The same can be said for even private lands that are not held in agriculture as well. Those vulnerable lands along the coast that we potentially estimate to be inundated in the future, if the landowner is interested in sort of capitalizing on the potential for blue carbon habitats to migrate into their lands, that could also be a financial incentive for them to not abandon that property in the future. So just those are things that we're talking about. We're at sort of the real early stages of these conversations, and the big part is having a willing landowner to pursue these projects on. Right now, the public lands are where these opportunities are being pursued, and particularly in Hillsborough County, although Manatee County is also considering a similar type of project as well.
Well, great. If you had additional questions that we weren't able to answer during Q&A, please feel free to try to get with Ed as we go into break.